Tanzania is an interesting place, not for just one reason, but for many. One, it is home to a civilization named Kilwa, which genetics say all the women were 100% African and the men were mostly Persian in their DNA. Now, if you believe this, that's fine. But we look back and Tanzania, according to historical record, was not influenced by either of these two people whose genetics are found in that region in the 1600s, who are responsible for this civilization. If you look further back, you find that the people would have been Cushitic, meaning they would have come from East Africa. But they were not the first people in that region either. Those people would have been closer to something of the Hadza or the Khoisan people. But we do find Cushitic people. The interesting thing is that area of Tanzania's ruins that are from the 1600s and that early first century to about the 1600s until the foreigners come in and completely take over. The interesting thing about it is there's a civilization that was already in that region and it was written about by the Greek people and it was called Rapta by the Romans. And the Romans who wrote about it said that it was a great trading port. But not only did they write that, they wrote about Raptum and they said there was a great city there. And this was way back in the day. Now, some people claim that these people must have been Cushitic and they couldn't have been Bantu because it's too early to have been the Bantu people. But let's read about it and see if we agree with what they're saying. A further 4 days' sailing, they say, brings us to another bay in which there is emporium of Essenia. It requires 2 days and nights to cross this bay. Then, after a day and night sail, one comes to the seaport of Serapinus. Thence begins the bay which leads to Rapta. A voyage of 3 days and nights. At the head of this bay, they say there is an emporium called Tonicus. From this emporium towards the Raptum promontory, there is, they inform us, a river called Raptus and also a city of the same name. Not far from the sea, the bay extending from Raptum to the Presum promontory, although great in size, is not of great depth. The barbarians who dwell on its shore are cannibals. We have learned also from the merchants that from Arabia Felix they sailed to Aramata, to Azania, to Rapta, and to the regions called Barbary. This sailing is not exactly south, but southwest. The voyage from Rapta to Prazum is also southwest. Now, there's only one problem. And this problem is that in the first century, when the Romans were writing about the Ethiopians that lived in this area called Rapta, who had a city there. The problem with this is there was already three people who lived in that area at that time. For example, the first wave of migration was the Southern Cushitic 4,000 years ago, which is about 2000 BC, right? Then it was the Nilotes, right? The Nilotic people. These are like the very dark people in Africa. They moved 2,900 years ago. And then there's the Mashariki Bantu people who moved from West Africa to this area of Tanzania at about the same time, 2,900 years ago, which would be before the Romans got there. And we know that they got there because they brought West African planting traditions with them. And as it says here, the staple food of yams. They subsequently migrated out of these regions across the rest of Tanzania between 2,300 and 1,700 years ago, which still kind of lines up with the time that is when Raptor is written about. So, what does this mean then? If the Bantu populations would have been present at that time, not only that, they would have brought their completely unique tradition, and later they would have destroyed other influences, genetic influences, being the dominant genetic influence in that area. Is it possible that the Bantu people, instead of being a small group in that area, were just the dominant genetic group and therefore was responsible for that civilization? Especially given the fact that they brought certain trade goods which line up with what is written about in Rapta. But how can we have the audacity to claim that Western Ethiopians who were from places like West Africa, Mauritania, or Libya made their way to East Africa? How could we dare make such a claim? Well, we don't have to because the ancient Romans do. As they say here, Gaetoli is located below Mauritania, the desert of Libya below Africa, and Cyrenaica. The great races which inhabit Libya are the Garamantes, extended from the source of the Bagradaz River to the Nubis Lake. In other words, the people, the Garamantes, these Ethiopians called Garamantes, and I've read that they said for the most part Garamantes were Ethiopian. The Garamantes, they start from the Bagradaz River, which is in that area of North Africa, all the way to the Nubis Lake, which are the Nubian lakes, by the lake by Nubia. Meaning, this is a connection between East and West Africa, occupied by one people. But modern history would make us think that Africans were separate in their knowledge of each other. So think about what I've already told you. The Bantu migration had already reached Tanzania. And of course, it reached by Tanzania by at least 300 years before they got hold of the information in the first century. And if you look at the Garamantes, they are from Tunisia all the way to Sudan, according to the writings of both Herodotus and all these other people who write about it. Herodotus, Pliny, Ptolemy, all of them. And then in Niger and those places, you have other Ethiopians which are documented. Then you have this place called Rapta, which is documented to have Ethiopians. And of course, it's considered a trade port. So it doesn't surprise me that there's multiple groups of Africans living in that region. What does surprise me is the ones who won. Why did the Bantu groups win over everybody else? Is it because they had a more sophisticated technology than a lot of the other people who lived in that area? Or are we going to sit here and claim that the people who had a less sophisticated technology conquered the Nilotic people who had invented a civilization prior in North Africa, and the Cushitic people who had invented another civilization prior in East Africa, that they got defeated by a bunch of people who had no skills whatsoever, especially considering that the people known as Ethiopians were known for their bows and how dangerous they were with a bow and arrow. And if you look at Bantu people as well, they're also known to use bow and arrows, but they're also known to be a very warlike people from top to bottom. And the recordings of the cannibalism around the borders doesn't surprise me at all, given the fact that there has been some records of Bantu people practicing cannibalism, sometimes cannibalizing people who weren't Bantu, like the Khoi people or the San people. So, what exactly is this evidence showing us? Just think about it for a second. Think about it for a second. You've got a migration. Now, the Bantu migration started way before this, but the migration reached Tanzania by this time, according to modern accepted views. So, is Rapta a Bantu civilization? If so, then what does that mean about the other civilization that had Bantu people in the 1600s? Could it be that the Persians that arrived there and there already was a civilization, and that Kilwa, instead of a invented civilization, was just an extended civilization? And like other Arabian states, what they did was they found an already built up nation, and they consumed the woman, which is an interesting part because the DNA tests show that 100% of the women were black Africans. They consumed the woman after they won that territory. Or even better, they bought a piece of land from the inhabitants and chose to live directly in that area and got their wives, starting something bigger than what we are imagining in our heads. The answer is yes, because we have multiple ways of checking, but the origins of Kilwa were of an African one and of civilizations in that region. We even have civilizations that go further south, which I will talk about later, which happened at the exact same time as Kilwa in the ninth century, all the way down to the first century. We have civilizations, of course, we're talking about Great Zimbabwe, we're talking about all these other places, and they've done DNA tests in these other places, and they don't have any Persian influence. They only have sub Saharan African influences. And so, what probably happened was that the Persians found a great civilization and they decided to Islamify it, just like how the Portuguese found Mozambique to be a great civilization, and they Portuguese-sized it in the 1600s. So colonization butters down these civilizations, but we all know that these places are African origin. But it's the Bantu part that gets denied, which confuses me because the Bantu people would have already arrived in this area by the time these civilizations exist. And if you look, the structures and the city and the explanations by the ancient Romans seem to line up very well with Bantu quote unquote migration.